This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. If you want to protect yourself online, which trust me, by the end of this video you will want to, or bypass country locks on sites like Netflix and YouTube, stick around until the end of the video to hear all about it. It sounds dramatic, but in many ways, the internet is a profoundly infectious disease. And I don't know what's more terrifying, the fact that you can literally find anything with a quick Google search, or the fact that we're no longer surprised by it. It's an understatement to say that the internet is a ubiquitous part of our lives. It's practically essential at this point, as we've now just seemingly and unconsciously surrendered ourselves to it. We've sacrificed our privacy, our virtues, our identity, hell, even our safety, to this technological enigma that feeds off our wants, needs, desires, our pure, unrelenting curiosity, that we're all victims to its hypnotic power. Look, you've heard all of this before, so hearing it again has as much subtlety as throwing a brick through your window to get your attention, but when we consider how the horror genre embraced the trends of their era, from fears of war and disaster through the creature features of the 40s and 50s, to the domestic horror of the 70s and 80s, to where we are today, it's no surprise that techno-thrillers and internet horror, as we'll call it, has had a recurring presence throughout the late 90s and 21st century. However, unlike the eras that came before it, I would argue that this trend hasn't been a particularly impactful one. As I said, a large part of it is that we're no longer fazed by anything on the internet, that creatively it's not as easy to replicate it without some level of exaggeration, especially considering that just literally being on the internet will always be inherently more scary because, well, that's where the real horror actually is. What it comes down to are two distinct approaches: over-embroider the internet as a scary place, as if it's some modern equivalent to a haunted house, or more effectively, play into our true fear, being that random victim we hope to never be, something that's made exceedingly more terrifying by the fact that our digital footprints are typically far bigger than many of us even realize. The technology itself isn't what's scary, as pretty much every pre-Y2K science fiction had already speculated about how technology would eventually enslave and doom us all, that by the turn of the new millennium, if anything, people were either bored by it, or had more than enough time to say their prayers and kiss their ass goodbye. Yet, where exactly did the principles of the internet horror subgenre emerge from when it came to popular media? As I said, nothing is scarier than the real thing, and there are countless creators out there who do an incredible job at highlighting and perpetuating horrors that we should take seriously. But of course, when it comes to cinema, a bit of fear-mongering goes a very long way, and at the start of the 21st century, the world was introduced to both these distinct approaches, one that explored internet horror in a mature, nuanced way, and one that cashed in on the paranoid lunatics that we truly are. In 2001, Japan gave us one of the top-tier horrors of the early 2000s called Kiero, or as we know it in English, Pulse, the story of a quiet invasion where ghosts used the internet to download themselves into reality. Trust me, it's scarier than it sounds. And in 2002, America gave us one of the top-tier examples of early 2000s abrasive American horror schlock in the form of Feardotcom, the story of an evil website that gives users 48 hours to live before killing them via their deepest fear. I know, sounds fairly familiar to another film we'll mention later. Now, rather than jump between the two, I'm just going to cover them individually because their differences and influences on the internet horror subgenre will naturally become apparent. It's worth noting that neither of these films were by any means the first of their kind, as previous decades had already established many techno-thriller concepts, and in particular with the 90s being probably the most significant decade for the internet, given how the personal computer had become increasingly commonplace in the average household. Both Pulse and Feardotcom were more so in the right place at the right time to capitalize on what had become the new popular domestic fear. Horror in the early 2000s was predominantly defined by supernatural stories, and in both Japan and America we saw two separate strands of filmmaking: the slow-burning chiller that leaves everything up to your imagination, and the bombastic "I found the effects panel in Premiere and now every scare is like setting off fucking fireworks in your face." They both have their charm. One is a style I wholeheartedly think made for some of the most genuinely terrifying films I've ever seen, if indeed they were monotonous at times, and yeah, sure, the other might give you epilepsy, but at least it was fun and kind of exciting in some respects. However, let's start with the one that's easiest on the eyes. In the simplest terms, Pulse is the more depressing of the two films, as it focuses much more on a melancholic human drama and uses its supernatural shenanigans for a heavier symbolic purpose. The story is broken up into two independent scenarios that eventually converge, but more or less follow a similar structure. People begin to see sinister images of shadowy people on their computer screens that gradually consume their victims before manifesting them into the afterlife, while the ghosts invade the living world. Admittedly, it's a little convoluted to explain much further beyond that, because the film tries to have its cake and eat it by attempting to explain itself while still wanting to keep things ambiguous. In a general sense, it's a story about loneliness and the fear of impending mortality, as the Tokyo setting is presented with an endlessly cold and desolate atmosphere. It frames its characters as distant from each other, almost seemingly unwilling to share their personal space. What Pulse does so effectively is capture the uncertainty of its time. The turn of the new millennium brought a sense of malaise and disillusionment with it, as nobody was really sure what was to come in this new century of now increasingly inescapable technological control. This new age of possibility felt overwhelming and isolating, as we devoted more and more of our time to computers that social interaction was now becoming a thing of the past. Hell, it might be something we one day forget how to do, which is tragically kinda true today. In fact, one of the characters, Mika, even works at a plant store that represents the film's only actual fragment of true nature, to show how we've lost touch with our world, as we're now stuck in these soulless concrete jungles that are made borderline dystopian by the lack of colour and lighting. But what I think speaks even more poignantly is how it centres this confused, oppressive state of mind around young people, just trying to understand both themselves and the strange new world they're about to inherit. When the ghosts finally appear, each victim eventually turns to ash and leaves a black shadow on the wall, symbolising their lasting presence in this world as nothing more than a mere stain of their existence. It's funny today how we mock concepts like Countdown about the killer app, or Stay Alive about the murderous video game, or Chainmail about the, well, evil chainmail, but there was a time when such ludicrous, far-fetched concepts like this had legitimate emotional value to them. When the film was remade by Americans in 2006, and that even goes for the One Missed Call remake, it made a complete mockery of the idea because it didn't understand how to translate such a surreal experimental concept into something that could be taken seriously, thus opening the floodgates for further nonsense that undermined the ability for genuinely good storytellers to explore such high concept ideas. Believe it or not, evil internet ghosts were once considered a grounded idea for a story, but since we later polluted it with an abundance of lazy efforts, our culture became disillusioned by it, on top of our increasing cynicism thanks ironically to the internet. I mean, look at this scene and tell me internet ghosts aren't scary. What Pulse does so powerfully is portray existential horror akin to Junji Ito by making the absurd seem so believable. As I said earlier, the central theme of the story is about loneliness, and throughout the film, the characters talk about the afterlife, the purpose of living, and what it would be like to have immortality. And when finally confronted by a phantom, it describes death as simply eternal loneliness. It's just an endless black void like the screens we stare at on a regular basis. Or alternatively, every day we're staring death right in the face. We're looking directly into our mortality and are soon going to be absorbed by it. The ghosts are not technically killing people, they're essentially giving their victims that eternal loneliness by trapping them in the same void they spent their lives staring at. These are characters who are looking to escape their loneliness and outrun their mortality only for it to inevitably catch up with them no matter where they go. The ghosts take over the world because we take it for granted. If we're supposedly lonely now and feel distant from reality already, what's really going to change? I do feel Pulse is too nihilistic and cynical towards the internet age, but nonetheless, its importance to internet horror is using the unknown and incomprehensible aspects of the technologically dependent age to basically explore our somewhat unconscious existence. In other words, it warns us of how we could potentially devalue our lives as we surrender ourselves, our knowledge, our purpose for existing to something that takes us further and further away from each other. Feardotcom, on the other hand, is a very different ballgame. Feardotcom represents the opposite spectrum of Pulse. Instead of building its horror around a human drama, it is very much exclusively devoted to a situational drama. In other words, Feardotcom very aggressively pushes the sinister nature of the internet with an incredibly violent and grotesque video nasty style that borders on being a dysfunctional exploitation flick. In fact, the best way to describe it is like watching Seven on a really bad acid trip. Not that I've ever tried acid. The point is, Feardotcom is a shamelessly unsubtle rip-off of Seven, which in its own right wasn't exactly a subtle film either, but at least it was delivered with a touch of nuance. The thing about Feardotcom is that it actually has two antagonists, which come with their own convoluted explanations that leave a few gaping plot holes when you think about it too long. The plot sees a detective and health researcher team up to track down the origins of a snuff porn website where subscribers pay to watch a serial killer torture and murder random women, while subsequently trying to understand how the same website, or at least what I think is the same website, is spreading a curse that kills users via their biggest fear. It's probably at this point I should say this film was ruthlessly panned by critics and bombed hard at the box office, but at the same time the film covered pretty much every basis of the subgenre that you can practically link any later internet horror to it. But with that said, Feardotcom doesn't have a single original bone in its body, because it basically copied and pasted its ideas from other sadistic thrillers like 7 and 8mm, both written by Andrew Kevin Walker. Its supernatural imagery is suspiciously similar to 13 Ghosts, which came out the year before it, granted that was a style at the time, and of course its plot device of having 48 hours before dying is taken from Ringu, the Japanese horror flick that helped establish this plunge into technological terror. However, while the film fell into complete obscurity, it definitely helped establish a modern template for these kinds of films. If I was in a virtuous mood, I'd probably call Feardotcom tasteless, but when you consider what's out there on the normal web, let alone the dark web, I think its repulsive nature is more fitting than I wish it was. It plays right into this dark, morbid, inhumane curiosity to see things we're only used to in fiction. Before everybody became a crybaby about violence in cinema, indulging in this grisly edge was fairly commonplace in a lot of early 21st century horror movies that, when we entered the torture porn craze of the mid-2000s, it felt vastly tame in comparison. In fact, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually think Roger Ebert best summarized the film. There's something relatively impressionistic about its visuals. Yes, they're overdramatic and really annoying at times, but they are provocative and experimental to say the least. Part of this is probably because this flashy visual style was a huge inspiration to me during my teenage filmmaking edgelord phase, but I still appreciate what it attempts to do psychologically to make you feel uncomfortable. Like I said in the beginning, the approach to internet horror comes down to either exaggerating the internet as the modern haunted house, or playing into the what-if scenario of you being the victim. Fear.com does both. The website is literally haunted by a vengeful spirit, and we do have a serial killer akin to the Toy Box Killer, preying on random women who tortures them until they beg to be killed. Now, since the film focuses most of its time on the cursed website, the killer plot is never developed in any meaningful capacity, and ends up feeling a bit out of place until it becomes relevant to the vengeful spirit's motive, which in its own right isn't exactly that well developed either. Just for context, the general gist of the plot is that the evil spirit is a former victim of the killer and looking for someone to unleash her to exact revenge. It's fine on paper, but doesn't really have the same emotional impact as Pulse's more allegorical approach. The big difference is that Fear.com is all style over substance, because none of the scenes flow or connect in any organic way, and it feels as if massive chunks of relevant plot details are missing to make the story seem coherent. It really just relies on its grisly imagery, but to its credit, this was the film that predated the torture porn craze, which was meant to be more than just about gore and violence. It was tapping into the same social and domestic vulnerabilities as 60s exploitation and 70s slasher flicks, but now with the added edge of technological insecurity over simply pure immoral barbarism. I mean, it doesn't do a terrific job at capturing this theme, at least not compared to 7, yet that's not really a fair comparison from a thematic point of view, but on a pure visceral level, I think it's effective at leaving you with some genuinely powerful nightmare fuel, even more so than 8mm, which actually tried to grind the other world of snuff films into a tangible reality. So where does that leave us? Well, from my perspective, internet horror is a genre about showing us how normalized terrible things are, and how we've become not only desensitized to it, but also potentially complicit to its existence. On the one hand, we can look at internet horror as merely a repetitive commentary on the negative effects web culture has on society, but that dilutes the more important contribution of the genre. It's not so much a warning, but a reminder of how easily we give ourselves away, how it's so easy to be absorbed by the internet's hypnotic allure that we potentially invite chaos and evil into our lives without ever truly knowing it. Yes, we all know the internet isn't a safe place, however, when you think about it time and time again throughout horror history and cinema, when has anywhere ever been a safe place? As long as we're able to hide behind false identities and masks, whether they be physical or digital, morality and safety are only concepts, and never a guarantee. If you enjoy this video as much as you enjoy having complete freedom from snoopers, hackers, or anyone being able to track your online activity, then ExpressVPN is for you. A virtual private network masks your IP address and encrypts your data while you're online, so you can protect your sensitive information when online shopping, checking your bank account, or accessing websites that seem suspect or dubious, like Feardotcom.com. But for most of you, ExpressVPN is perfect for being able to bypass country locks on YouTube, Netflix, Prime, and even Disney+. For example, one of the films I referenced, Unfriended Dark Web, is not available on the US Netflix server, but it is available on the UK one. So by downloading the app for your phone, tablet, computer, or whatever device you like to use, you simply select a country of your choosing, click connect, and now you can enjoy watching a bunch of people get stalked by hackers because they didn't use ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is less than $7 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if it turns out it's not really your thing, don't worry, you will get a full refund. So take back your internet privacy today with ExpressVPN and find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking my link in the description box below. And until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon.